Hello, everyone. My name is John McKay. I'm the Member of Parliament for Scarborough-Guildwood, and this is our latest installment of What We Give. I have as my guest John Ivison. I was going to say the famous John Ivison. And certainly in his mind, he's famous. But John is a friend from times past, and he's really got legitimate credentials to be one of Canada's foremost journalists. He's written two books, one of which is a book about the passions of Robbie Burns. John does wear his Scotsness on his sleeve, but also bureau chief here in Ottawa, and has written a very serious political book about the current prime minister. But John, as many of you will immediately discern, he was born in Scotland, raised in Scotland. And so the obvious question is, John, what are you doing in Canada?
I hate to correct you there, but I wasn't actually born in Scotland.
Oh, my.
My father was Scottish, and he was working in England. And when I was born, married my mother there, and I was actually born in England, which is it pains me to say that, but then was swiftly whisked back north of the border. And this is a real accent. I'm not faking it.
I know it's a real accent here. Well, I stand corrected, or so you're actually English, but you don't publicize that too very often, I wouldn't think.
There is still a bitter rivalry, I guess. There is maybe a jealousy, a chip on either shoulder from Scotland. It's kind of a similar, maybe an inferiority complex to the Canada-US thing, but there is the added.
Who's the inferior? Is it the English or the Scots?
Well, I think the Scots have always had a bit of an inferiority complex, just because of the proportion. I mean, it's kind of similar to Canada-US, 10-1. There's this neighbour who, in England's case, is frequently invaded and run the country. And
I'm sure you've read the book "How the Scots Invented Modernity."
Yep. And but he milks the point a little bit, but there's a lot of it that's true when it comes to the Scottish Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution and some of the great figures that made our world today.
Indeed. But also the huge influence the Scots had on Canada, and the way in which certainly when they landed in Montreal and probably weren't quite as hated as the English, but had an immense influence, particularly on the banking system and the university system, with Mr. McGill being the prime enlightenment.
We can maybe come back to this later, but I felt this when I was in Ottawa, and certainly when I moved to Ottawa, that it was everywhere. Every Remembrance Day there were pipe bands and kilts everywhere, and there was a lot of inbuilt and ingrained Scottishness in Canada's traditions and history and institutions that maybe had been forgotten a little bit. The country had changed so much that it wasn't being recognised how much of an influence the Scots had. And I ended up with now departed Senator Doug Finlay. We set up the Scottish Society of Ottawa and tried to resurrect and remind people about the Scottish influence in Canada.
Yeah, I noticed that you and Doug Finlay had organized that, and certainly when there are Scots events, particularly the Robbie Burns dinner, John Ivison is front and center. But we are getting a little ahead of ourselves here. So you were born in England, raised in Scotland, went to the University of Glasgow.
Yep.
What did you study there?
History, geography, just general arts degree. Probably qualified for nothing in particular, but I think the typical learning how to learn experience.
Yeah, exactly. I sometimes wonder whether that's true today, where kids are just sort of working on how they're going to get their next mark in order to be able to get to where they're going to go. So, was your family a learner of learners family? No,
my father was an engineer, civil engineer. So.
They don't qualify as people who learn.
Well, he had an aptitude which I never. he passed on to me a love of history and geography, but not of an ability. I can count arithmetic wise, but not some of the finer skills that you need to be an engineer. And I had no interest in that. So that was my family background.
Is that a prerequisite to being a journalist, not being able to add or subtract?
I think prerequisite to being a journalist is that you need to be pretty unemployable in any other.
Functionally, well, I feel the same way. In another life, I was a lawyer, so I'm functionally useless at everything.
Right. Yeah. So there's a bit of that kind of jack of all trades thing, and also a sort of congenital inability to accept direction from anybody or authority.
No wonder lawyers and journalists get along so well. Inability to accept direction, doesn't play well in the sandbox with anybody else, and mathematically challenged. Yeah, well, okay.
Yep.
No wonder we have good conversations, John. So, and your mom, what did she do?
She was working real estate for many years, but not a career particularly.
Yeah. And so you go to University of Glasgow, and then by some means or another, the nascent National Post or the nascent Financial Post recruits you to come from Scotland because you're already working as a journalist there. So just out of curiosity, why were they so keen on John Ivison, the Scotsman, to come and help them out with the post?
The missing bit there was that after I left Glasgow, I came to McMaster in Hamilton.
Oh, okay.
A master's degree there. Went back to Scotland, worked as a journalist, came back to Canada again and got another master's degree in journalism at Weston. So there was already an affinity with Canada.
Oh, I see. So that's not as if they're just plucking you out of nowhere.
No, but so I had some interest in coming here, family reasons as well. My wife at the time is Canadian, and so we came back. In fact, she'd been living in Scotland and was a journalist for the Sunday Times in the UK, and I was working for the Scotsman, and they were more interested in her than they were in me at the time. But I came on her coattails when the Post was set up, which is now 24 years ago. And it was, at the time people were saying it was doomed. There's not many of us left who were there on day one 24 years ago, but in fact, I think I'm the longest serving now. But it's been assumed to be moribund for nearly a quarter of a century.
Yeah, it's a long time to be moribund, isn't it?
Yeah, we're not dead yet.
No. The news of our demise is entirely premature.
Yeah.
So you were there for the Conrad Black era, I assume.
Yep.
And then all of the various iterations that came and went after that. So it leads into, and part of the reason why I wanted to talk to you, the profession of journalism is under severe strain these days from a whole variety of directions, and yet you've survived. The Post has survived. I'm assuming that people are making a living out of it at least. What are your reflections on the current state of journalism and the challenges that affect a senior, well-respected national reporter like yourself?
Well, I don't have any great worries about my own future. If it were to end tomorrow, then I could look back and think it was a pretty good run, 32 years in total. But I do worry about the future. I mean, it still has not figured, the profession or the craft of journalism has still not figured out how to monetize the eyeballs that we get. I mean, the readership, most of the readership numbers are pretty strong. People still read. Now they read online rather than in print, but but much of our expense base is still on the printed product. And unfortunately, a lot we still rely far too heavily on the printed product for revenue. The digital revenue has increased almost exponentially. I mean, I don't have the numbers in front of me for Postmedia, but for most, that statement is true for most publishers. But it's still, unless you're the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, you know, a handful of titles around the world which seem to have cracked this code, it's very, very hard. And I just don't see how the profession survives in its current form for much longer. I mean, we have journalism schools churning out hundreds and hundreds of graduates. There are no jobs for them now, and I don't see any increase on the job front. In fact, I see on the contrary, I think it's going to contract further. It is very, very hard to generate revenue out there, and the people who are coming into the profession are being paid not particularly well. It's a pretty depressing scene. And then on top of all of that is this new divisiveness and contempt for institutions, of which the mainstream media is top of the list.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
along with politicians.
Along with politicians and
Yeah.
you know, Supreme Courts and central banks. It's a pretty dismal picture. I mean, I've got two older kids who are 21 and 18, both of whom I'm trying to push away from journalism, despite they seem to be gravitating towards it. But I just don't see how you make a good long-term living as a journalist these days.
Everybody and their dog seems to be a journalist. You get on a you get on a platform like this one, and suddenly you're a journalist, and you're pontificating about whatever it is you're pontificating about.
Robert Louis Stevenson said that politics and journalism are the only two professions for which no preparation is required.
Oh, well, that suits me perfectly. And yet there doesn't seem to be a consensus on what constitutes truth and fact. And you, as a professional journalist, having worked 32 years, written a couple of books, head of the Ottawa Bureau, you're pretty religious, if you will, about truth and facts. I think it was Churchill who said you're entitled to your opinion, but you're not entitled to the facts. I hope that's a Churchill quote, and I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong. And that strikes me, if you will, as at the core of why journalism is fracturing into many, many different pieces, and in the fracturing makes it difficult to monetize, let alone even make a living at it. But I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Well, I think we've used the rubric of journalism to include just opinion, and everybody's got an opinion. So, I mean, you can set up a website and start spewing opinion and call yourself a journalist, and nobody's going to sue you. Well, they might sue you for getting it wrong, but they're not going to sue you for trace descriptions. But you get to the bottom of it there, that it is about facts. And so opinions have to be based on the facts. And I think far too much opinion is based on conjecture and things that are not researched, or they're pulled from dubious sources. And I think that we're talking about institutions and the how they're in peril and they're under threat. But the media, the sort of traditional, and it's mainstream media is used in a derogatory sense, but the mainstream media is mainstream because I think based on facts that they're not subject to conjecture or
Mhm.
opinion. They are. Robbie Burns would say, "Facts are chiels that when he ding." These facts are fellows that can't be disputed, and you can have conflicting opinions on a set of facts, but the facts have to be established and agreed upon in the first place. And I think that we're fracturing. I mean, that's part of the problem, is that mainstream media used to be, a number of television stations and a handful of newspapers, and now it is a multiverse of podcasts and whatever else. And so stuff is coming out of right, left, and I really don't know where we go with that, because I think we're starting to get some sense of light touch regulation around this. And I think
Well, that's an issue I wanted to pick up on. There's no legal consequence to untruth. If you want to go after somebody, you're going after some sort of platform and a URL address, and that's it. So as long as there's no legal consequence, then people will be free to spin any kind of facts that they wish to spin. And then you have people in politics, particularly more obvious ones, proceeding with alternative facts. I don't know what alternative facts actually means. It's one of those nonsense things that Kellyanne Conway used to, she used to put it out as a regular Trumpism. And I think you're right to say that it's hard to know where to go with this. If there's no consensus on facts, there's no legal consequence on facts, and people are free to spin whatever theory they want out of alternative facts.
I mean, alternative facts is a euphemism for lying, and we do have libel laws. That's the bottom line. You can sue somebody for libel, but it's a very convoluted, expensive process. I think that there are ways that modern media providers can make things better. For example, on our comments at the end of the stories, we started requiring people to put their names on it rather than some pseudonym. I think Twitter at some point is going to have to regulate who can post in it. You should put your real name on it, and maybe it even requires a name and an address before you get an account.
Yeah,
that's the type of light touch regulation. I've got mixed feelings on it, because I am a very passionate about free speech too, and people should be allowed to say what they want to say within the limits of the law, which is in this case the law of libel. But I think it was John Stuart Mill who said, your right to free speech, or your right to swing your fist.
Fist ends with my nose.
Up at the end of my nose.
Yeah.
We're getting to the point where there's a lot of noses are getting bloodied.
Mm-hmm.
And so some changes are definitely required. I mean, I think we just saw this explosion of social media, and it's taken some time for any kind of regulation. I mean, it was the Wild West for a long time, and I think it's starting to get a little bit better.
Your idea of requiring name and address in order to be able to exercise your right of free speech doesn't seem to be unreasonable to me.
No.
Certainly, we get a flood of emails into the office every day, many of which are just garbage material. That's why the delete button was invented. And I have a standing instruction to my staff that don't answer emails from people who are out, unless we can identify the person, and certainly they have to be in the writing. I'm not going to represent, or I'm not going to respond to the views of people who are represented by other MPs. That's their job, not mine.
Right.
So,
and I think I lost my train of thought there. What was I going to say on that subject? Twitter getting its act together a little bit. I think Facebook's doing that a little bit too. But a lot of what is happening out there on social media is that people know that to get a response, you just say something outrageous.
Yep.
And a lot of times it seems to be not even a human being. It's just some kind of bot-generated comment, which then sparks an explosion of vitriol and divisiveness.
Mm-hmm.
I think there must be ways that Twitter, for example, can cut down on the number of bots that are on its site. And this is what Elon Musk is complaining about.
I was just going to go there. Yes, exactly.
He doesn't want to buy it now because he thinks half of the users are not even human.
Yeah, and so what's the point of buying something that's really a fake whole enterprise?
Yeah.
Well, if in fact he wins his loss, sorry, go ahead, John.
Well, I was just going to say, but real people are getting angry, responding to these deliberately provocative things that are said by bots and bot farms that are just purely designed to screw up our democracy. These are the kinds of areas that I think, firstly, Twitter needs to and other social media sites need to self-regulate, and if they don't, then governments need to get involved.
I think the play out of Elon Musk will be actually quite interesting, because if he wins his lawsuit or gets the price reduced on Facebook, that will be a wake-up call to the financiers who make these things relevant, that this asset is not nearly worth what you think it's worth.
Yeah.
I suppose if the National Post put up its sales figures as 100,000 real people and 50,000 not so real people, my guess is that your revenues would decline quite precipitously, and I don't know why that wouldn't apply to other platforms as well. So
I agree with you, and I think, but to your point earlier that people are cynically using this almost appetite to be outraged for their own political ends. That is a really disturbing development that we've seen, and I think that I think that we as long as I've been on Parliament Hill 20 years now, and I know you've been there longer, there was always there were always parameters within which governments and politicians operated. And I remember the economists, watching Canadian politics from 20,000 feet when Stephen Harper defeated Paul Martin and said, Canada has swapped a moderately left of centre government for a moderately right of centre government. And, a lot of people raged in Canada about Harper being an extremist, but, looking back on that government, it was relatively mainstream and still operated within these parameters. And I'm worried that now that we're seeing those parameters being eroded, and that to win votes in the era of social media, we're seeing a polarization of the political parties.
Well,
you and I are
you win on the basis of the polarization. So you see what's going on in the U.S. Trump has a huge following, and has successfully manipulated that whole following into a kind of an army almost. And you have a pale imitation of that currently in the Conservative leadership race. How that plays out, I don't really know. I mean, the speculation is that you win the leadership race and you lose the election, and I don't know whether that'll be true or whether that's not true. But it is a self-limiting way in which to get political power, shall we say?
Yeah, and I think it's really worrying the sort of intolerant right, which Pierre Poilievre is definitely playing to, and then we've got the illiberal left, which I think Justin Trudeau has played to, really cynically. When we came to vaccine mandates and some of the things he said about people who weren't vaccinated, at a time when I think the country needed to hear a more healing message. And I think that both of these things are being done quite cynically for purely electoral gain. Poilievre's challenge, if he wins, I mean, I think he will win, but it's not absolutely guaranteed. I mean, there may be a reaction from sensible centrist conservatives who feel that he can't win a general election. So let's not elect him as leader. I suspect that won't happen. He's not the type who's going to pivot and repudiate everything that he said, but I do think he'll tone down some of the wilder stuff about the World Economic Forum and some of the conspiracy stuff, institution bashing stuff from the Supreme Court and the Bank of Canada, and turn up the message about the economy and inflation and the failure of the current government to deliver basic services.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I agree with you. I just don't know about his ability to pivot. The old story
I don't think he will pivot. I don't think he's going to suddenly turn into a completely different. I mean, I think we saw what happened when Erin O'Toole tried to do that.
Yeah.
He was the true blue conservative, and then he suddenly became who he really was, which was more a centrist consensus conservative, and he got eaten alive by his own party. I mean, Poilievre is not going to fall for that make that same mistake.
Yeah,
because that's not who he is. But we're in this 7th year of a Liberal government, and we're probably going to be in the 9th or 10th before there's a general election. Never a good time to be in government when you're that long in the tooth.
well, people got sick of Moses, so so he had a bit of a rough time, there's just a lifespan to a leader, and that's just the way it is. And even if the leader has done reasonably well over a period of time, and you and I might well disagree as to how well Mr. Trudeau has done, but having said that, there is just simply an element that I guess kind of gets sick of you people telling you to eat your broccoli. So,
I mean, he may get a renewed boost from people who just look at the Poilievre-led Conservative Party and think it's beyond the pale.
Well, the conservative that is a Jean Charest conservative, or even an Erin O'Toole conservative, is going to have a gag reaction to some of the stuff that Poilievre has said, and while they may not be able to swing to a vote for Mr. Trudeau, they may well sit on their hands, which is almost as good from a Liberal standpoint as not. But just let me finish off. We were getting into this whole business of journalism and the influence of bots and others. And I was talking to somebody yesterday, a journalist yesterday, and he was saying that in Vancouver, the Chinese government, the government of Beijing, is making considerable effort through the diaspora community to influence the election and elect for want of a better term, a Beijing-friendly city council from Vancouver. And it's not just idle speculation. There was, in the last federal election, there was arguably influence from Beijing in that election. In the U.S., there was more than arguable influence from Russia certainly in 2016 and possibly in 2020. And democracy, in some respects, has no defenses to those attempts at influence. And I'd be curious about your thoughts as we kind of wind this thing up, as to where we're going to go, from both a journalistic standpoint, but a political standpoint. You're one of the more keen observers in the nation.
Yeah, I think this is a real concern, and that's been basically been my focus of my thought process for the last few months. In that, I think things were looking pretty precarious, and I'm sort of heartened by the response to Ukraine. Democracies have suddenly woken up and said, this idea that we've cherished for so long is worth fighting for, and it's worth defending, and it's worth, we've been complacent, and we've allowed the autocrats to have it their way for far too long. And I think there has been a sort of awakening that we need to do more to protect our cherished democracy and our cherished institutions. And it's funny because the book I'm currently reading is it's a biography of Xi Jinping, the most powerful man in the world, by two German journalists. I'm not sure it's out in English yet. I've got an advanced copy, and it's really worth reading. And we've got. I just was reading another book by Naomi Wolf, the Canadian author, very left-wing author,
right,
about the new authoritarians, almost mirroring the argument being made on the far right by the convoy folks that we've got these authoritarian governments in our democracies that are going to try and control our way of life. They ain't seen nothing yet if they want.
Exactly.
Xi does not just want to, he says the goal is no less than the creation of a new kind of human being. It's almost biblical. What he wants to do. In pursuit of this noble goal, Xi decided to evaluate his subject in so-called social credit system. Points are awarded for good behavior. And if you want a promotion at work, you've got to have a good score.
And if you're a Uyghur, do not apply.
Yeah, well, if they do not agree, illegal religious activity, Falun Gong, if you score sinks below 850 points, I think you were originally awarded 1,000. It sinks below 850, you receive a warning. Below 600, you're publicly exposed, and it goes on and on. This is the new authoritarianism. And
he wants to turn Canada into a vassal state.
Right. So this is the challenge in the mid 21st century for Canada, not not the World Economic Forum or any of this other nonsense that people are, it just blows my mind that these conspiracy theories that are going around, when the clear and present danger is right in front of us. It's the autocracies of the world who want to strip away the democracy that generations of our forefathers have fought and died for.
Yeah. Well, John, that's a depressing note, but maybe that's where we should end it.
It's not over yet. I think it's kind of encouraging that we've at least recognized some of these problems.
I think a person like yourself writing about these kinds of issues, and I would even add in the issue of the Chinese government handing out various medical things to our universities and our hospitals, and expecting to collect DNA evidence is I don't think you need to delve too far into conspiracy theories to say there's something up here and it's not going to work for us. So the democracy as we know it and have enjoyed it for the last several generations is under threat. I appreciate you, John, for writing about it and thinking about it. And may I say that I rather hope that in the next few days you are once again a proud father of a little baby.
Yeah.
And I appreciate you taking your time to talk to us when I'm sure this is a pretty anxious time for your family.
It's been a good distraction. Thank you, John.
Okay. Well, you take care. Thanks, John.
Okay. All the best.
Bye-bye.